The execution of Robespierre was far more brutal than you could imagine in the blood-stained squares of revolutionary Paris, where the machinery of death had become the symbol of political justice, and the guillotine's blade fell with mechanical precision upon the necks of thousands of victims during the Terror's darkest months. There occurred one of history's most ironic and brutal executions, the systematic destruction of Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of revolutionary violence, whose own demise would surpass in cruelty and psychological torment even the elaborate tortures he had orchestrated for his political enemies, creating a spectacle of revenge that transformed the champion of revolutionary justice into its most agonizing victim. This is the investigation into how the man who had perfected the art of political execution through mass terror became the target of an equally ruthless campaign of destruction that subjected him to hours of excruciating physical and psychological torture before his final death, revealing how revolutionary violence inevitably consumed its own creators through the same merciless logic they had applied to their perceived enemies. Today, we explore the eyewitness accounts, contemporary newspapers, and official records that document the final hours of Robespierre's life, revealing how his arrest, imprisonment, and execution became an elaborate exercise in political revenge that deliberately prolonged his suffering while providing the traumatized population of Paris with the cathartic spectacle of watching their former oppressor experience the same terror he had inflicted upon thousands of innocent victims. Our investigation begins with the political crisis of July 1794, when Robespierre's increasingly paranoid behavior and threats against fellow revolutionaries finally convinced his former allies that the architect of the terror had become too dangerous to survive, leading to a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that would trap him in the same web of accusations and summary justice he had used to destroy so many others. Contemporary accounts describe how the conspiracy against Robespierre developed over several weeks as his fellow committee members recognized that his growing megalomania and threats against virtually every other revolutionary leader meant that they would either destroy him or be destroyed themselves, creating the political conditions for his dramatic fall from absolute power to condemned prisoner. The events of July 27, 1794 9 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar began with what appeared to be a routine session of the National Convention, but quickly transformed into a coordinated attack on Robespierre that caught the master manipulator completely off guard and demonstrated how quickly revolutionary politics could turn former allies into mortal enemies. Parliamentary records reveal how Robespierre's attempt to deliver what he intended as another of his characteristic speeches defending revolutionary virtue was interrupted by carefully planned accusations from former supporters who had decided that their own survival required his immediate destruction, leading to his arrest and the collapse of his political machine. The initial arrest of Robespierre and his closest allies created immediate chaos as various revolutionary factions attempted to rescue or eliminate the fallen leader, with armed confrontations throughout Paris that lasted for hours and resulted in numerous deaths as the city descended into the kind of violent political struggle that had characterized the entire revolutionary period. Contemporary eyewitness accounts describe how Robespierre was initially taken to the Luxembourg prison, but was refused admission by guards who feared that housing such a controversial prisoner would make them targets for revolutionary violence, leading to a desperate search for secure detention that lasted several hours while armed mobs roamed the streets. The confusion surrounding Robespierre's initial imprisonment allowed his supporters to briefly rescue him and bring him to the Hôtel de Ville, where he spent several agonizing hours attempting to organize resistance while suffering from what appeared to be a severe psychological breakdown as he realized that his political career and possibly his life were finished. During his time at the Hôtel de Ville, contemporary accounts describe Robespierre as completely unable to function effectively, alternately weeping, raging, and falling into periods of complete silence as the reality of his situation gradually penetrated his shocked consciousness, and he began to comprehend the full extent of his political isolation. The final phase of Robespierre's capture occurred when National Guard troops stormed the Hôtel de Ville around 2 a.m. on July 28, leading to a confrontation that resulted in a severe gunshot wound to Robespierre's jaw under circumstances that remain historically controversial, with some sources claiming he attempted suicide while others suggest he was shot by attacking soldiers. Medical records from the period describe the devastating nature of Robespierre's jaw wound, which shattered his lower mandible and left him unable to speak clearly while causing continuous bleeding and excruciating pain that lasted for the remaining hours of his life without any significant medical treatment to relieve his suffering. Contemporary accounts reveal how Robespierre spent the final 12 hours of his life lying on a table at the Committee of Public Safety headquarters, bleeding from his shattered jaw, while crowds of former victims and their relatives gathered outside to mock his suffering and demand his immediate execution in scenes that demonstrated the complete collapse of his former authority. Eyewitness descriptions of Robespierre's condition during his final imprisonment paint a picture of extraordinary physical and psychological agony, with the former dictator unable to eat, drink, or speak while remaining fully conscious and aware of his desperate situation as crowds outside called for his death with the same enthusiasm he had once inspired for the execution of his own enemies. The psychological torture inflicted on Robespierre during his final hours was intensified by the deliberate decision of his captors to deny him any medical treatment for his wound while forcing him to listen to the crowds outside celebrating his downfall and demanding his immediate execution with chants and songs that mocked his former power and promised revenge for his crimes. Contemporary newspapers describe how word of Robespierre's capture and impending execution spread rapidly throughout Paris, drawing enormous crowds who gathered around the building where he was held to participate in what became a massive celebration of his downfall that lasted throughout the night and demonstrated the depth of popular hatred he had inspired. The formal legal proceedings against Robespierre were deliberately minimal, with the Revolutionary Tribunal that had condemned thousands of victims to death under his direction now applying the same summary justice to their former master, completing the paperwork for his execution in a matter of hours without any pretense of due process or legal defense. On the morning of July 28, 1794, Robespierre was loaded onto the same type of cart that had carried thousands of his victims to the guillotine. But his journey to the scaffold was deliberately prolonged to maximize both his suffering and the crowd's satisfaction as they witnessed the man who had terrorized Paris being subjected to the same treatment he had imposed on so many others. Eyewitness accounts describe how the crowds that lined Robespierre's route to the guillotine were among the largest and most hostile of the entire revolutionary period, with thousands of people gathering to mock, curse, and throw objects at the man who had become the symbol of revolutionary tyranny and whose downfall represented liberation from months of terror and arbitrary death. The physical condition of Robespierre during his final journey was described by contemporary observers as shocking even by the standards of revolutionary Paris. With his blood-soaked clothing, shattered jaw, and obvious agony creating a spectacle that satisfied the crowd's desire for revenge while demonstrating the complete destruction of his former dignity and authority. Contemporary accounts reveal how Robespierre's execution was deliberately staged to maximize the psychological impact on both the condemned man and the watching crowd, with the executioner taking extra time to prepare the guillotine while allowing the former dictator to fully comprehend his situation and experience the same terror he had imposed on his victims. The final moments before Robespierre's execution were marked by an incident that increased his suffering when the executioner roughly tore away the bandages covering his wounded jaw, causing fresh bleeding and excruciating pain that prompted screams from the man who had sent thousands to their deaths with cold efficiency and apparent indifference to their suffering. The actual execution of Robespierre occurred at approximately 6 p.m. on July 28, 1794, with contemporary accounts describing how the crowd's roar of approval when his head fell was among the loudest heard during the entire revolutionary period, demonstrating the intensity of popular satisfaction at witnessing the destruction of the man who had embodied the terror's worst excesses. The aftermath of Robespierre's execution marked the effective end of the terror, with his death removing the driving force behind the systematic campaign of political violence that had claimed thousands of lives and traumatized French society, while simultaneously demonstrating how revolutionary violence inevitably consumed its own architects through the same merciless logic they had created. Modern historical analysis has revealed how Robespierre's execution represented not just the death of an individual, but the symbolic destruction of the entire system of revolutionary terror that had dominated French politics for over a year, with his brutal treatment serving as a form of collective catharsis for a society that had been traumatized by months of arbitrary violence and political persecution. The irony of Robespierre's fate, experiencing the same prolonged suffering and public humiliation he had imposed on thousands of victims, has made his execution a defining example of how political violence tends to consume its own creators, with the methods and attitudes that enable mass persecution inevitably being turned against those who initially wielded them as instruments of power. As we examine the eyewitness accounts, official records, and contemporary descriptions that document Robespierre's final hours, we discover how the architect of revolutionary terror became the victim of an even more elaborate exercise in political cruelty that deliberately prolonged his physical and psychological agony while providing his former victims with the satisfaction of watching their oppressor experience the same helpless terror he had imposed upon them, creating a spectacle of revenge that demonstrated both the brutal logic of revolutionary violence and the inevitable fate of those who seek to control society through systematic terror and the arbitrary exercise of deadly power over human life.